The cabin sat like a tomb in the Montana wilderness, its windows boarded shut for 70 years. Sarah Chen clutched her eviction notice with trembling hands, her 6-month belly pressing against the steering wheel as she stared at the inheritance she never wanted. 3 days until homelessness, negative $47 in her account. This rotting cabin was her last hope. But Sarah wasn't just another broke pregnant woman. Before her world collapsed, she'd been Dr. Sarah Chen, art historian specializing in World War II looted treasures. She recognized the German military insignia, carved into the doorframe immediately. Inside, beneath decades of dust and mouse droppings, she found them. Paintings rolled in oilcloth, jewelry sewn into mattresses, and gold bars stamped with Nazi eagles. $230 million worth of stolen art and treasure hidden by her grandmother who'd never spoken of the war. The discovery should have solved everything. Instead, her phone started ringing. Unknown numbers, breathing on the other end. Someone else knew about this cabin, and they'd been waiting a very long time to claim what was inside. But who was her grandmother, really? And why did she have Hitler's stolen fortune? Sarah's hands shook as she unrolled another canvas, revealing a Monet water lily painting she'd studied in graduate school, one that had vanished from a Jewish collector's home in Paris, 1943. Her grandmother May had been a seamstress, or so Sarah had always believed, a quiet woman who spoke little English and even less about her past. The baby kicked hard against her ribs as Sarah crouched beside a wooden crate. Inside, wrapped in yellowed newspaper dated 1945, lay a jade Buddha statue and dozens of photographs. Black and white images of her grandmother, impossibly young, standing beside uniformed men. Nazi uniforms. Sarah's breath caught. In one photo, May wore an elegant dress, her arm linked with a tall SS officer outside what looked like a museum. She was smiling. The phone rang again. This time Sarah answered. Dr. Chen. The voice was elderly, heavily accented. German, perhaps. You have found something that does not belong to you. Who is this? Sarah's voice cracked. Someone who has been very patient. Your grandmother made promises before she disappeared. Debts that must be honored. The line went dead. Sarah stumbled outside, gasping mountain air into her lungs. Her academic mind raced through possibilities. Art restitution cases she'd worked on, the meticulous Nazi documentation of stolen treasures, the underground networks that had moved stolen goods across continents as the war ended. Her grandmother had never been just a seamstress. Back inside, Sarah found a loose floorboard near the fireplace. Beneath it lay a leather journal, its pages brittle with age. She opened to the first entry, written in careful English script. May 1945. They think I'm helping them escape, but I am taking everything. The gold will buy a new life in America. The art will ensure my daughter never knows poverty. Klaus suspects nothing. Sarah's throat tightened. Her grandmother had been a thief, stealing from thieves. But the stolen art had original owners. Families torn apart by the Holocaust, collections seized at gunpoint. Another entry caught her eye. August 1945. Klaus is dead. The Americans found our route through Switzerland. I alone know where the treasure waits. I will never return to claim it. My daughter must never know what I have done. The baby moved restlessly as Sarah read on, page after page of her grandmother's confessions, seducing Nazi officers, learning their smuggling routes, taking maps and access codes meant to help war criminals escape to South America. But May had kept the treasure for herself and vanished. A car engine rumbled outside. Sarah's blood froze. She was 60 miles from the nearest town, on a dirt road that led nowhere else. She peered through a gap in the boarded windows. A black SUV sat in the clearing, its engine running. Her phone buzzed with a text. Come outside. Alone. We need to discuss your inheritance. Sarah's mind calculated frantically. The nearest neighbor was 40 miles away. No cell towers for miles. Her ancient Honda couldn't outrun anything built after 1995. She grabbed the leather journal and shoved it inside her coat. Whatever happened next, she needed proof of what she'd found. The cabin door creaked as she opened it. Two men emerged from the SUV, one elderly with silver hair and expensive clothes, the other younger, built like a soldier. The older man smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Dr. Chen, I am Otto Richter. I believe you have found something that belonged to my father." He gestured toward the cabin. "Klaus Richter. Your grandmother was his business partner." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly. "I don't know what you're talking about." Otto's smile widened. "Of course you do. You are an expert on stolen Nazi art. You know exactly what that cabin contains." He stepped closer. "The question is whether you are reasonable, like your grandmother should have been, or whether this becomes complicated." The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of snow and secrets buried too long. The drive north took 4 hours through increasingly desolate countryside. Sarah's Honda wheezed up mountain roads that hadn't seen proper maintenance in years, past abandoned gas stations and houses with broken windows that stared like empty eye sockets. The GPS signal had died 20 miles back, leaving her with handwritten directions on a coffee-stained napkin. When she finally found the turnoff, a dirt track barely wider than her car, doubt crept in like cold air through the Honda's worn weather stripping. The baby kicked, a sharp jab against her ribs, as if sensing her anxiety. She pressed a hand to her belly and whispered, "Almost there, little one." The cabin materialized through the trees like something from a fairy tale, though not the cheerful kind. Dark logs chinked with decades-old mortar, a stone chimney that listed slightly to one side, windows so grimy they looked black. Grandmother Ingrid's sanctuary sat in a clearing barely large enough to park, surrounded by towering pines that blocked most of the afternoon sun. Sarah killed the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. The only sounds were wind in the branches and the Honda's engine ticking as it cooled. No cell service, of course. The nearest neighbor was probably miles away. For the first time since leaving the city, she wondered if this was a terrible mistake. The front door key was exactly where the lawyer had said it would be, under the third loose stone in the foundation. The lock fought her, rust flakes falling like brown snow, but finally gave way with a groan that seemed to echo through the forest. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the lingering smell of wood smoke. Grandmother Ingrid had died in February, and the cabin felt like it had been holding its breath since then, waiting for someone to disturb its sleep. Sarah fumbled for a light switch, found none, then remembered the lawyer mentioning a generator. Late afternoon light filtered through dirty windows, revealing a space that was larger than it appeared from outside. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by built-in bookshelves stuffed with volumes in what looked like German. A simple kitchen occupied the far corner, no modern appliances, just a wood-burning stove and a hand pump at the sink. Everything was neat but ancient, as if time had stopped sometime in the 1940s. Sarah set her overnight bag on a wooden table and explored further. 2 bedrooms, one obviously Ingrid's with its narrow single bed and crucifix on the wall, the other completely empty except for dust and cobwebs. A bathroom with a clawfoot tub and no shower. It was rustic in the extreme, but the bones of the structure were solid. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Sarah realized she needed to eat something. The lawyer had mentioned a root cellar stocked with preserves, accessible through a trapdoor in the kitchen floor. She found it near the stove, a heavy wooden square with an iron ring pull. The hinges protested as she lifted it, revealing wooden steps descending into darkness. The smell that rose up was earthy and cool, tinged with something metallic. Sarah retrieved a flashlight from her bag and carefully made her way down. The root cellar was larger than expected, carved directly from the rocky hillside. Shelves lined the walls, filled with mason jars of preserved vegetables and fruits, their contents murky in the weak light. But it was what she saw in the far corner that made her breath catch. A trunk, old, military-looking, painted olive green with brass fittings gone black with age. Stenciled numbers and letters in faded white paint. And beside it, partially hidden under a mouldy tarpaulin, the corner of what looked like another box. Sarah approached slowly, flashlight beam dancing ahead of her. The trunk wasn't locked. The hasps hung open, as if someone had been in a hurry when they last closed it. She lifted the lid with trembling hands. Gold. More gold than she had ever seen outside of a movie. Bars of it, each the size of a paperback book, stamped with eagles and symbols that made her stomach lurch with recognition. Nazi eagles, swastikas, and German text she couldn't read but somehow understood meant nothing good. There had to be 50 bars, maybe more, each one probably worth, she couldn't even calculate it, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, enough to solve every problem in her life, to give her baby a future she'd never dared imagine. But as she knelt there in the musty darkness, surrounded by her grandmother's carefully preserved vegetables and a fortune in stolen Nazi gold, Sarah felt nothing but a growing dread. This wasn't salvation. This was something much more dangerous. Above her, a floorboard creaked. She froze, flashlight beam wavering. Another creak, deliberate and careful. Someone was in the cabin, someone who had moved silently enough that she hadn't heard them enter. The baby kicked frantically now, as if sensing danger. The lockbox felt heavier than it should have as Sarah carried it to the kitchen table. Her hands trembled slightly, whether from pregnancy hormones, exhaustion, or anticipation, she couldn't tell. The brass key slid into the lock with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting decades for this moment. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed tissue paper, lay a collection that made her breath catch. Photographs, documents, and jewelry nestled together like secrets finally ready to surface. Sarah lifted the first photograph with careful fingers. Black and white, slightly faded, it showed her grandmother as a young woman standing beside a man in uniform. Not American, she realized with growing unease, but German. Greta looked radiant, almost glowing, her arm linked with the officer's. On the back, in her grandmother's careful script, Munich, 1943. My darling Klaus. Sarah's stomach dropped. 1943, the height of the war. Her grandmother had never mentioned being in Germany, never spoke of anyone named Klaus. The family stories always placed Greta in Sweden during the war, working as a seamstress, until she met Sarah's grandfather in 1946. Another photograph showed the same couple at what appeared to be an elegant dinner party. Men in SS uniforms chatted with women in expensive gowns, crystal glasses catching the light of elaborate chandeliers. Greta wore a stunning sapphire necklace that seemed oddly familiar. Sarah's blood ran cold as she recognized it, the same necklace now lying in the bottom of the lockbox. Her fingers moved to the documents beneath. Marriage certificate, dated April 1944, Greta Müller and Klaus Richter. But that was impossible. Greta had married Charles Sullivan, Sarah's grandfather, in Boston. Sarah had seen those wedding photos 100 times. A bank document from Switzerland caught her attention. Account numbers, transaction records, all in her grandmother's name. The amounts made her dizzy, millions of dollars transferred systematically over decades. The most recent transaction was dated just 3 months before Greta's death. Thunder rumbled overhead as Sarah reached for a leather-bound journal. The entries were in German, but scattered English phrases jumped out at her. The shipment arrived safely. Klaus insists we must wait. The Americans are getting closer. A loose page near the back was entirely in English, dated 1962. Charles suspects nothing. The new identity has held for 16 years. Sometimes I catch myself almost forgetting who I was before, but then I touch Klaus's ring and remember. The gold must stay hidden until it's safe. Too many people died for it. Too many people would die for it still. Sarah's hands shook as she set down the journal. Her grandmother, sweet cookie-baking Greta, who taught her to knit and spoke with that faint accent she claimed was Swedish, had been someone else entirely. Someone with secrets worth killing for. A car door slammed outside. Sarah froze, listening. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Through the kitchen window, she glimpsed headlights cutting through the rain. Two vehicles parked where the dirt road curved toward the cabin. Moving quickly, she began shoving everything back into the lockbox. The photographs, documents, jewelry, evidence of a life her grandmother had hidden for 60 years. Her heart hammered against her ribs as footsteps approached the front door. The knock was firm, authoritative. "Mrs. Chen? Federal agents. We need to speak with you." Federal agents? Sarah's mind raced. How had they found her here? How did they even know about the cabin? "Mrs. Chen, we know you're inside. We're here about your grandmother's property. We just want to talk." She clutched the lockbox against her chest, thinking frantically. The window over the sink faced the woods. She might be able to slip out the back while they waited at the front door, but running would only confirm their suspicions, whatever those might be. "Just a minute," she called out, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. The brass key turned smoothly as she locked the box, but where to hide it? The cabin was small, offering few options. The bedroom closet? Too obvious. Under the kitchen sink? They'd search everywhere. Her eyes fell on the stone fireplace. Greta had always kept the damper closed, complaining about drafts. Sarah grabbed a kitchen chair and climbed up, struggling with her shifting center of gravity. The lockbox fit perfectly in the chimney's narrow ledge, invisible from below. Another knock, more insistent this time. "Mrs. Chen?" She climbed down, tucked the brass key into her pocket, and smoothed her shirt over her belly. Whatever her grandmother had been involved in, whatever secrets lay buried in that lockbox, she wasn't ready to hand them over to strangers in the night. The rain had intensified, drumming against the windows like urgent fingers. Sarah walked to the front door, took a deep breath, and turned the handle. Two figures stood on the porch, badges glinting in the porch light. Behind them, barely visible in the darkness, she could make out at least two more people waiting by the cars. "Good evening, Mrs. Chen. We're sorry to disturb you so late." The morning sun filtered through the cabin's grimy windows as Sarah methodically searched every inch of the small structure. Her grandmother's journal had mentioned beneath where angels watch, and Sarah was determined to decode every cryptic reference. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her mounting anxiety. She'd already examined the obvious hiding spots, loose floorboards behind the stone fireplace inside the old cedar chest. Now she studied the walls more carefully, running her hands along the rough-hewn logs, feeling for inconsistencies. The cabin was smaller than she remembered from childhood visits, just two rooms connected by a narrow doorway. In the bedroom, faded photographs lined a makeshift shelf. Sarah paused at one, showing her grandmother as a young woman, standing beside a tall man in uniform she didn't recognize. The image was dated 1943. Beside it sat a small porcelain angel, chipped and yellowed with age. Angels. Sarah lifted the figurine carefully. Beneath it, carved into the wooden shelf, was a small symbol, two interlocking triangles. Her pulse quickened. She pressed against the wood and felt it give slightly. The entire section of shelf slid inward with a soft click. Behind it lay a metal box, no larger than a shoebox. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled it free. The lock had long since rusted, and the lid opened with minimal pressure. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were documents, German documents. Sarah's college German was rusty, but she recognized enough words to understand these were official papers, transportation records, names and dates, and beneath those, a letter written in her grandmother's careful script. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have found what I could never bring myself to destroy, though God knows I should have. What I'm about to tell you will change how you see everything. Our family, our history, the very foundation of who we are." Sarah sank onto the bed, the letter shaking in her hands. "In 1943, I was not the simple farm wife everyone believed. I worked for the Underground Railroad that helped Jewish refugees escape through our county. Your grandfather knew nothing of this. It was too dangerous for him to know. One night, a contact brought me something that would haunt me for the rest of my life." The baby kicked hard, and Sarah pressed her free hand to her belly, trying to steady herself for whatever revelation was coming. A German officer, fleeing the collapsing Reich, had died in a car accident near Miller's Creek. His vehicle contained gold, Jewish gold, stolen from families murdered in the camps. Bars and bars of it, marked with Nazi eagles. My contact and I buried it, planning to find a way to return it to surviving family members. But the war ended, the records were scattered or destroyed, and we had no way to trace the rightful owners. Sarah's breath caught. The mysterious fortune her grandmother had allegedly hidden wasn't family money at all, it was Nazi plunder, blood money. I kept the location secret, even from you, my darling granddaughter. I told myself I was protecting you from this burden, but there were others who knew what that German officer carried. Powerful men who built their post-war fortunes on silence and buried secrets. They'd been watching, waiting, believing the gold was lost forever. A chill ran down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the cabin's drafty interior. I've seen cars driving slowly past the farm, received phone calls where no one speaks. They know I was involved that night, and they know I'm the last link to their secret. By the time you read this, I'll likely be beyond their reach. But you won't be. Sarah's hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the letter. The gold is buried beneath the old oak behind the cabin, 30 paces north, then 10 west. There's enough there to solve all your financial troubles, my dear one. But taking it means accepting that these men will come for you. They've killed to protect this secret before. Mrs. Henderson from the Underground Railroad died in what everyone called a kitchen fire in 1987. Thomas Mueller, who helped that night, supposedly had a heart attack while fishing alone in 1994. Sarah's mind reeled. Her grandmother had lived for decades knowing she was marked for death, carrying this terrible secret. I pray you'll be wiser than I was. Take what you need and disappear, or leave it buried and run anyway. But whatever you choose, trust no one completely. These people have resources, connections, patience. They've waited 70 years to tie up this loose end. The letter was signed with a shaking hand. All my love and deepest regrets. Grandma Rose. Sarah sat in the sudden silence, processing the magnitude of what she'd discovered. Outside, a car door slammed. Then another. Footsteps crunched on gravel, moving toward the cabin with deliberate purpose. She stuffed the letter and documents back into the box, her mind racing. The front door's hinges creaked, a sound she hadn't made herself. They'd found her. The morning light filtering through the cabin's dusty windows revealed details Sarah hadn't noticed in yesterday's fading daylight. She moved carefully through the small space, her hand instinctively resting on her belly as she examined the simple furnishings with fresh eyes. Everything appeared exactly as her grandmother had left it. Too exactly, perhaps. The coffee cup on the kitchen table still held dried remnants at the bottom. A book lay open on the armchair, reading glasses folded neatly beside it. But something felt orchestrated about the scene, like a stage set designed to suggest a peaceful, ordinary life. Sarah had learned not to trust ordinary anymore. She pulled out her phone, hoping for a signal strong enough to call Marcus, but the screen showed nothing. The isolation that had seemed like a blessing yesterday now felt ominous. If someone came looking for the gold, she'd have no way to call for help. The basement called to her, though every instinct screamed against returning to that hidden room. She needed to understand what her grandmother had truly left behind. Armed with the cabin's lone flashlight and a kitchen knife that made her feel only marginally safer, she descended the wooden stairs. The hidden panel remained open, revealing the room's contents in stark detail. Sarah counted the gold bars methodically, 47 pieces, each stamped with Nazi eagles and swastikas that made her stomach turn. Conservative estimates put the collection's worth in the millions, maybe tens of millions. Enough money to solve every problem in her life, enough to guarantee her child's future, if she could figure out how to claim it without getting killed. But as she examined the bars more closely, inconsistencies emerged. Some showed more wear than others, as if they'd been handled frequently. A few bore additional markings she hadn't noticed before, small scratches that could have been random damage or might represent some kind of code. Her grandmother had been meticulous about everything. These marks weren't accidental. Sarah photographed each bar with her phone, documenting the various markings. Whatever game her grandmother had been playing, she'd left clues. The question was whether Sarah could decipher them before others came looking. A sound from upstairs froze her blood, the distinct creak of the cabin's front door opening. Sarah switched off the flashlight and pressed herself against the basement wall, knife gripped in trembling hands. Footsteps moved across the floor above, deliberate and searching. "I know you're here." The voice was male, cultured, with a slight accent she couldn't place. "Your car is outside." Sarah forced herself to breathe silently. Through the floor she could hear him moving methodically through the rooms, opening doors and drawers. He knew the cabin's layout, had been here before. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," he continued, his voice closer now. "Smarter than we gave her credit for, certainly. She played a very dangerous game for a very long time." The footsteps stopped directly above the basement entrance. Sarah's heart hammered so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "The gold isn't yours to take," he said. "It belongs to people who've waited 70 years to reclaim what was stolen from them. People who won't hesitate to eliminate anyone standing in their way." A long pause stretched out, filled only by the cabin's settling sounds. Then the footsteps resumed, moving toward the back of the cabin. Sarah heard the rear door open and close. She waited, counting her rapid heartbeats before daring to move. When she finally crept up the stairs, the cabin appeared empty. But on the kitchen table sat a manila envelope that hadn't been there before. Her name was written across it in neat block letters. Inside she found photocopied documents, shipping manifests, bank records, correspondence in multiple languages. The papers painted a picture of systematic looting during the war's final days, gold stolen from Jewish families and resistance fighters hidden away by fleeing Nazis. But these weren't random documents. They traced specific transactions, specific people. At the bottom of the stack was a handwritten note. "Your grandmother wasn't the victim you think she was. Ask yourself why a simple war refugee ended up with a fortune in Nazi gold. Some secrets are better left buried, especially when you have a child to protect." Sarah's hands shook as she read the words again. Everything she thought she knew about her grandmother, the stories of escape and survival, of building a new life in America, began to crumble. Had Eleanor been a victim or a collaborator? Had she stolen this gold herself or taken it from its original thieves? The sound of car engines approaching snapped her back to immediate danger. Through the window, she could see 2 black SUVs winding up the mountain road. There was no time to gather the gold, barely time to think. Sarah grabbed the documents and her grandmother's journal, then slipped out the back door just as the vehicles pulled up to the cabin. Hidden in the tree line, she watched armed men emerge and surround the building. These weren't casual visitors. They'd come prepared for violence, and Sarah realized with crystal clarity that her grandmother's legacy might cost her everything, including her life. The rain had stopped by the time Sarah reached the gas station on Route 47, but her hands still trembled as she gripped the steering wheel. The clerk behind the bulletproof glass looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, his eyes barely lifting from his phone as she approached. "I need to use your restroom," she said, sliding a $5 bill through the slot. He buzzed her through without a word. In the grimy bathroom, Sarah splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made her look older than her 28 years. She pressed her palms against her belly, feeling the slight curve that had only recently begun to show. "We're going to figure this out," she whispered to the baby. "I promise." But even as she said the words, doubt gnawed at her. The weight of the gold bars in her trunk felt heavier with each passing mile, as if gravity itself was conspiring against her. She'd counted them twice, 37 bars, each stamped with the unmistakable eagle and swastika of the Third Reich. Conservative estimates put their value somewhere north of $2 million. Money that could solve every problem she had. Money that could also get her killed. Her phone buzzed with another text from Marcus. "Where are you? Called in sick, but your boss is asking questions." She deleted it without responding. Marcus meant well, but he lived in a world where problems could be solved with logic and persistence. He'd never understand that some secrets were buried so deep that disturbing them could bring down everything around you. The bell above the door chimed as she walked back to her car. The parking lot was empty except for her beaten Honda and a black sedan that definitely hadn't been there when she arrived. Two men in dark suits stood beside it, their attention focused on something in the distance. They looked like federal agents from a movie. Too clean, too purposeful. Sarah's pulse quickened. She walked casually to her car, fishing for her keys while keeping the men in her peripheral vision. One of them turned in her direction, and she caught a glimpse of pale blue eyes and a scar running from his left temple to his jaw. She'd seen those eyes before. In the photograph tucked inside one of Grandma Rose's journals, a picture labeled "Bad Men." Never trust. Her grandmother had known about them, had been watching them, or they'd been watching her. Sarah slid behind the wheel and forced herself to start the engine normally, resisting the urge to floor it out of the parking lot. In her rearview mirror, she watched the scarred man pull out a phone and make a call, his eyes tracking her license plate. The Honda's engine wheezed as she merged back onto the highway, and Sarah realized she had maybe an hour before they caught up with her. The car was falling apart, she was running low on cash, and she had nowhere to go that they couldn't find her, except maybe one place. She'd avoided calling him for 6 months, ever since their relationship had imploded in a spectacular mess of accusations and broken promises. But Tommy Castellano owed her, and more importantly, he had resources that existed outside normal channels. If anyone could help her understand what she'd stumbled into, it was him. The phone rang 4 times before his familiar gravelly voice answered. "Sarah? Jesus, I thought you were dead. I need help, Tommy." "Yeah, well, get in line. You disappear for half a year and now—" "I'm serious. This isn't about us. I found something and there are people who want to kill me for it." A pause. In the background, she could hear music and the clink of glasses. He was at Rourke's, the dive bar where he conducted most of his business. What kind of something? Sarah glanced in her mirrors again. Still no sign of the black sedan, but that didn't mean much. The kind that could get both of us disappeared if I say it over the phone. "Christ, Sarah. Where are you?" "About 40 minutes out. Can you meet me at the old warehouse district?" "The one by the rail yard?" "Yeah, okay. But this better not be some scheme to—" "Tommy." She let the desperation creep into her voice because it was real and he needed to hear it. "Please. I wouldn't call unless I had no other choice." Another pause, longer this time. "Warehouse 12. Give me 30 minutes. The line went dead." Sarah pressed harder on the accelerator, coaxing another few miles per hour out of the struggling engine. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering again, dark and heavy with the promise of rain. She thought about her grandmother, alone in that cabin for so many years, keeping these terrible secrets locked away. What had Rose been planning to do with the gold? Why hide it instead of turning it over to authorities? The answer, Sarah was beginning to realize, might be the only thing standing between her and a shallow grave. The morning light filtered through the dusty cabin windows as Sarah stared at the photograph in her trembling hands. The black and white image showed her grandmother as a young woman, standing beside a uniformed Nazi officer outside what appeared to be a Swiss bank. Grandmother's smile was radiant, her hand resting possessively on a leather satchel. The same satchel Sarah had found hidden beneath the floorboards, filled with more gold coins than she could count. Her phone buzzed against the wooden table. Marcus again. She'd been avoiding his calls since yesterday, unable to process what she'd discovered. How could she explain that the woman who'd raised her, who'd taught her about kindness and integrity, had apparently been involved with Nazis? "Just tell me you're safe." Marcus's voicemail pleaded. "I don't care about the argument. I'm worried about you and the baby." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her belly. The baby kicked as if responding to its father's voice. She needed to go home, needed to figure out what this all meant. But first, she had to understand the truth about her grandmother's past. The photograph felt heavy in her hands as she examined it more closely. There was something familiar about the officer's face, a sharp jawline and piercing eyes that reminded her of someone. She flipped the photo over and found faded writing in her grandmother's careful script, Heinrich, Switzerland, 1943. Our new beginning. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Heinrich. She'd heard that name before, whispered in hushed conversations between her grandmother and her elderly friends at church. They'd always stop talking when Sarah entered the room, switching to discussions about recipes or the weather. The cabin door creaked, and Sarah's head snapped up. The morning breeze had grown stronger, pushing against the old wooden frame, but something felt different, wrong. She carefully tucked the photograph into her jacket pocket and moved toward the window. A black sedan sat at the end of the dirt road, its engine running. Even from this distance, she could see two figures inside, watching the cabin. Sarah's heart began to race. She thought about the man from yesterday, his cold eyes and expensive suit so out of place in this rural setting. Had he found her? Moving quickly but quietly, Sarah gathered the remaining photographs and documents scattered across the table. The gold coins clinked softly as she stuffed them back into the satchel. Whatever her grandmother had been involved in, people were still willing to kill for it 60 years later. The car doors slammed shut outside. Sarah's training as a nurse kicked in, the same calm efficiency that helped her handle medical emergencies. She scanned the cabin for another exit. The back door led into the woods, her best chance. But first, she needed to hide the evidence. Footsteps crunched on the gravel outside, deliberate and unhurried. They knew she was trapped. Sarah lifted a loose floorboard near the fireplace and shoved the satchel underneath, covering it with decades of dust and debris. The photographs went into her jacket, pressed against her ribs. If something happened to her, at least Marcus would find them eventually. "Miss Chen?" a voice called from outside, polite but commanding. "We know you're in there. We just want to talk." The accent was slight, but unmistakable. German. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She moved toward the back door, each step carefully placed to avoid the creaking board she'd memorized as a child. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," the voice continued. "She helped preserve something very important. We simply want to ensure her legacy remains protected." Sarah reached the back door and slowly turned the handle. The woods behind the cabin stretched for miles, thick with pine and oak trees that had sheltered her childhood adventures. If she could reach the old logging trail, she could make it to the main road and flag down help. The front door rattled as someone tested the handle. Sarah slipped outside and into the tree line just as she heard the front door splinter open. Her pregnancy made moving quickly difficult, but adrenaline pushed her forward through the undergrowth. Branches caught at her clothes and scratched her face, but she pressed on. Behind her, voices erupted in sharp German. They'd discovered she was gone. She reached the logging trail and broke into an awkward run, one hand protecting her belly. The baby seemed to understand the danger, remaining still as Sarah navigated the uneven path. Her grandmother had walked this same trail countless times, teaching Sarah about the local plants and wildlife. Had those walks been cover for something darker? Had grandmother been planning escape routes even then? The sound of pursuit grew louder behind her. Sarah's lungs burned, but she could see the main road ahead through the trees. A truck rumbled past, someone who could help. She burst from the woods just as the truck's taillights disappeared around a bend. The road stretched empty in both directions. Sarah stood gasping in the morning sun, alone with her grandmother's secrets and the growing certainty that her life would never be the same. The forest seemed to close in around Sarah as she stumbled through the underbrush, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, the sound of breaking branches and shouted commands grew closer. She pressed one hand to her belly protectively while using the other to push through the tangle of pine boughs that scratched at her face and arms. She had maybe a 5-minute head start, but these men knew the terrain better than she did. The realization that they'd been watching the cabin, possibly for days, made her stomach lurch. How long had they known about the gold? And more importantly, how much did they know about what her grandmother had hidden? A sharp crack echoed through the trees and Sarah's blood ran cold. A gunshot. They weren't just trying to scare her anymore. She veered left toward where she remembered seeing a creek during her earlier explorations. If she could reach the water, maybe she could mask her trail. The baby shifted restlessly inside her, as if sensing her panic, and she whispered a silent apology for putting them both in danger. The creek appeared through the trees, a narrow ribbon of black water reflecting the overcast sky. Sarah splashed into it without hesitation, the icy shock stealing her breath. The current tugged at her ankles as she waded upstream, trying to move as quietly as possible while still maintaining speed. "Check the water!" The voice carried clearly through the forest, closer than she'd expected. "She's heading for the old logging road." Sarah's heart sank. They did know this area intimately. Every path, every landmark, every escape route. She was a city girl playing a deadly game on their home field. But then she remembered something. A conversation with her grandmother years ago about secret places in the forest. Margaret had mentioned old mine shafts from the 1920s, most of them sealed off, but some still accessible to someone small enough to squeeze through the barriers. If she could find one of those shafts... Sarah climbed out of the creek and oriented herself using the moss-covered boulder she'd noticed earlier. The mines, if she remembered correctly, were higher up the slope, where the old-growth pines gave way to scrub brush and exposed granite. She began climbing, her breath coming in short gasps. The pregnancy made everything harder. Her balance was off, her stamina depleted, but desperation drove her forward, step by agonizing step. A beam of light swept through the trees below her. Flashlights, at least 3 of them, spread out in a search pattern, professional, methodical. These weren't just thugs, they were experienced hunters. The trees thinned as she climbed higher, leaving her more exposed. She dropped to her hands and knees, crawling between the rocks and low shrubs. Her palms were torn and bleeding by the time she spotted it. A rusted metal grate partially hidden behind a fallen log. The mine entrance was smaller than she'd hoped, barely wide enough for her shoulders, but it was deep, disappearing into blackness that spoke of tunnels extending far into the mountainside. Sarah tested the grate. It was loose, held in place more by rust and debris than any real structural integrity. She worked frantically to pull it aside, metal scraping against stone with sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet forest. Finally, she created an opening just large enough to squeeze through. The voices were getting closer now. She could make out individual words, directions, coordinates, tactical communications. These people operated like a military unit. Sarah took a deep breath and squeezed through the opening, immediately regretting it as the musty air filled her lungs. The mine shaft sloped downward at a steep angle, and she couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. But it was shelter, and right now that was all that mattered. She pulled the grate back into position as best she could, then began making her way deeper into the tunnel. The walls were rough-hewn rock, shored up with rotting timber that creaked ominously as she passed. How stable was this place after nearly a century of abandonment? A sound from outside made her freeze. Footsteps, moving slowly and deliberately past the mine entrance. A beam of light played across the grate, and Sarah held her breath, pressing herself against the tunnel wall. "Anything?" a voice called out. "Nothing here. Just old mining debris." The light moved on, but Sarah waited several more minutes before allowing herself to breathe normally again. She was safe for the moment, but she was also trapped. The men might be gone for now, but they wouldn't give up. They'd search systematically until they found her, and when they did, she doubted they'd give her another chance to run. Sarah pulled out her phone, hoping against hope for a signal in the depths of the mine. The screen showed no bars, just as she'd expected. She was completely cut off from the outside world, alone in a tunnel that could collapse at any moment, carrying her grandmother's deadly secret and nowhere left to turn. The encrypted ledger pages spread across the cabin's small dining table like pieces of a deadly puzzle. Elena's fingers traced the faded German script, her high school language classes barely adequate for the task ahead. Each entry seemed to document transfers, weights, and what appeared to be location codes, a meticulous record of systematic theft. Her laptop screen glowed beside the yellowed papers, translation software struggling with the antiquated handwriting and military abbreviations. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her mounting anxiety. She'd been at this for 3 hours, and the patterns were finally beginning to emerge. Zongold, dental gold, she whispered, the words feeling poisonous on her tongue. Jesus, Grandma Rose, what were you involved in? A sudden creak from the porch made her freeze. The wind had died down an hour ago, leaving the forest unnaturally quiet. Elena closed the laptop and gathered the papers, her movements quick and silent. She'd learned to trust her instincts since Marcus's death. They'd kept her alive this long. The floorboard near the front window groaned under someone's weight. Elena slipped into the bedroom, clutching the documents to her chest. Through a gap in the curtains, she glimpsed a dark figure circling the cabin, moving with practiced stealth. Not a random intruder. This person knew how to hunt. Her phone showed no signal, the mountains effectively cutting her off from help. The .38 revolver felt heavy in her trembling hands as she crept toward the back door. Grandma Rose's escape route. Every paranoid preparation was starting to make terrifying sense. The forest canopy blocked most of the moonlight, turning the woods into a maze of shadows and twisted branches. Elena moved as quietly as her pregnant body allowed, following the faint trail she'd discovered earlier. Behind her, a flashlight beam swept across the cabin's windows, professional, methodical, deadly. 20 yards into the trees, she heard the front door splinter. Glass shattered as the intruder abandoned stealth for speed. Elena pressed deeper into the wilderness, thorns catching her jacket, branches whipping at her face. The baby protested each jarring step, but stopping meant death. Her foot caught a root and she stumbled, papers scattering across the forest floor. In the darkness, she scrambled to collect them, knowing these documents were her only leverage, her only hope of staying alive long enough to understand the truth. A few pages disappeared into the undergrowth, lost forever. The flashlight beam found her trail, dancing between the trees like a vengeful spirit. Elena forced herself to move faster, her lungs burning with each ragged breath. The old hunting trail curved downward toward what she hoped was the county road, though nothing looked familiar in the darkness. Behind her, branches snapped under heavy footsteps. Her pursuer was gaining ground, no longer concerned with stealth. Elena clutched the remaining papers and pushed forward, desperation overriding exhaustion. The baby's father was already dead because of this secret. She wouldn't let their child die too. A clearing opened ahead, bathed in unexpected moonlight. Elena recognized the old stone foundation Grandma Rose had shown her years ago, ruins from a defunct mining operation. More importantly, she could see headlights moving along the valley road below, civilization, safety, witnesses. She stumbled into the clearing and immediately realized her mistake. The open ground left her exposed, visible. The flashlight beam locked onto her like a targeting laser. Elena spun around to face her hunter, the revolver raised with both shaking hands. "Far enough," she called out, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "I know what you're after, and running doesn't solve anything." The man who emerged from the tree line was younger than expected, wearing expensive outdoor gear that marked him as no common criminal. His weapon remained holstered, but his stance suggested he could draw faster than she could pull the trigger. "Ms. Vasquez," he said, his accent cultured, possibly European. "You're in possession of materials that don't belong to you. Materials that certain parties would prefer to remain private. Private enough to kill for?" Elena kept the gun trained on his center mass, fighting to control her breathing. "My boyfriend died because of these papers. How many others?" The man's expression didn't change. The past has a way of creating complications in the present. Your grandmother understood discretion. She knew when to look away, when to stay silent. That arrangement kept her comfortable for many decades. She was blackmailing you. She was pragmatic. As you should be. He gestured toward the papers clutched in her left hand. Your child deserves a future, Ms. Vasquez. Don't let misplaced idealism rob them of that opportunity. Elena's arms were beginning to shake from the weight of the gun and the adrenaline coursing through her system. The headlights on the road below seemed impossibly distant, but the papers in her hand represented answers, justice, maybe even the truth about why Marcus had to die. My grandmother spent her whole life running from something, Elena said. I'm tired of running. The morning light filtered through the cabin's dusty windows as Sarah knelt beside the loose floorboard, her hands trembling as she pried it open once more. The golden gleam beneath seemed to mock her, a treasure that had become a curse overnight. She needed to think, to plan, but every rational thought dissolved into panic when she remembered the silhouette at her window. Her phone buzzed against the wooden floor where she'd dropped it. Marcus again. She'd ignored his calls since yesterday, unable to face his questions about why she'd left so abruptly. How could she explain that her grandmother, sweet, church-going Nana Rose, had been harboring Nazi gold for over 70 years? The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her distress. Sarah pressed her palm to her belly, whispering reassurances she didn't believe herself. We're going to figure this out, little one. Somehow. She photographed the gold bars with shaking hands, counting them methodically. 37 pieces, each stamped with the unmistakable eagle and swastika. The serial numbers were still visible despite decades of tarnish. This wasn't some family heirloom or inheritance. This was stolen treasure, blood money that countless people had died for. A car engine rumbled up the mountain road, growing closer. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized the sound, the same deliberate pace as yesterday's visitor. She quickly replaced the floorboard and grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace, her pregnant body moving with surprising agility born of pure terror. The engine stopped. A car door slammed. Through the front window she glimpsed a silver sedan, expensive and pristine against the rustic backdrop. A man emerged, tall, well-dressed, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to power. He wasn't the shadowy figure from last night. This was someone who operated in daylight, which somehow made him more terrifying. He approached the front door with confident strides, as if he owned the place. Sarah backed against the far wall, gripping the poker so tightly her knuckles went white. Miss Chen? His voice carried an upper-class accent, cultured and cold. I know you're inside. We need to discuss your recent discovery. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribcage. How did he know her name? How did he know what she'd found? My name is Hartwell, he continued conversationally. I represent certain interests that have been monitoring this property for quite some time. Your grandmother was very cooperative over the years. I trust you'll be equally reasonable. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Nana Rose had been working with these people. Her grandmother, who'd raised her after her parents died, who'd taught her right from wrong, had been part of this conspiracy? I'm not going anywhere, Sarah called out, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. And I'm not alone. A soft chuckle reached her through the door. Miss Chen, we both know that's not true. Your phone records show no calls in or out since yesterday evening. Your boyfriend believes you're taking some personal time to grieve. No one knows where you are. The casual invasion of her privacy sent ice through her veins. These people had been watching her, tracking her movements, monitoring her communications. How long had they been planning this? What do you want? She asked. Simply to continue the arrangement your grandmother honored for 7 decades. The items in this cabin remain undisturbed, and you live a long, healthy life. It's quite simple, really. And if I refuse? The silence stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if he'd left. Then his voice came again, closer now, as if he'd moved to the window. Your grandmother never asked that question. She understood that some secrets are worth preserving, regardless of one's personal feelings about the past. Rose Kowalski was a practical woman. Sarah's mind reeled. Her grandmother's maiden name had been Sullivan, not Kowalski, unless everything she'd known about her family history was another lie. I need time to think, she managed. Of course. But not too much time. Others are aware of your recent inheritance, and they're far less patient than I am. Consider this a courtesy call, Ms. Chen. The next visitors may not be so civilized. Footsteps retreated across the porch. The car door slammed again, and the engine started. Sarah waited until the sound faded completely before collapsing into her grandmother's rocking chair, her whole body shaking. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and scrolled through her contacts until she found Dr. Reeves's number. If anyone would know about her family's real history, it would be her grandmother's longtime physician. But as she prepared to dial, a text message appeared from an unknown number. Beautiful baby you're carrying. Due in 6 weeks? It would be such a tragedy if anything happened before then. 48 hours, Miss Chen. Choose wisely. The phone slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor as Sarah doubled over, understanding with crystal clarity that she was trapped in something far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. The rain had stopped by the time Sarah reached the edge of Millbrook, but the storm cloud still hung low and threatening overhead. She parked the Honda behind a cluster of pine trees, far enough from the main road to avoid detection, and studied the towns spread out below her through the windshield. Millbrook looked like a postcard of small-town America. White church steeple, tree-lined streets, Victorian houses with wraparound porches. But Sarah knew better now. Beneath that pastoral facade lurked secrets that had festered for over 70 years. She pulled out her grandmother's journal and flipped to the pages she'd marked. Eleanor's handwriting grew increasingly frantic as the entries progressed through 1944. The coded references to packages and storage made sense now. Her grandmother hadn't been complicit, she'd been terrified. October 15th, 1944, he came again today. Says the packages must stay hidden until the heat dies down. I told him I want no part of this anymore, but he reminded me what happened to the Schmidt family. I think of my little ones and stay quiet. November 2nd, 1944, heard rumors that someone talked to the authorities about the railroad cars. 3 more families disappeared overnight. God help us all. Sarah's hands trembled as she read. Her grandmother had been protecting her children, Sarah's father among them, from people who murdered without hesitation. The same people whose descendants were hunting her now. A knock on her passenger window nearly stopped her heart. Through the rain-streaked glass, she saw a weathered face under a green park ranger hat. The man appeared to be in his 60s, with kind eyes and a concerned expression. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah cracked the window an inch. You okay, miss? Noticed you've been sitting here a while. Sarah forced a smile. Just checking my map, getting my bearings. You lost? I know these parts pretty well. Something in his tone suggested more than casual helpfulness. Sarah studied his face more carefully, noting the way his eyes kept darting to the journal in her lap. Actually, I'm looking for information about my family. My grandmother used to live around here. Eleanor Hoffman? The ranger's entire demeanor shifted. His friendly expression vanished, replaced by something Sarah couldn't quite read. Recognition mixed with what might have been fear. Hoffman? You said? Yes. Eleanor Hoffman. She lived here during the war years. The ranger glanced around nervously, then motioned for Sarah to roll down the window further. When she complied, he leaned closer. Name's Pete Gallagher. My grandfather was the railroad supervisor here during the war. You need to get out of this town. Now. Sarah's pulse quickened. Why? What do you know? I know enough to recognize Eleanor's journal when I see it. And I know that people have been asking questions about you since yesterday. People who aren't from around here. What kind of people? The kind that carry government credentials and expensive guns. Pete's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. My grandfather left me some papers when he died. Letters, photographs, things he said I should keep safe but never look at unless someone came asking about Eleanor Hoffman. Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with fear. You have evidence? Meet me at the old lumber mill on Route 9, 2 miles north of town. 1 hour. And miss, whatever you think you know about what happened here, it's worse than you imagine. Before Sarah could respond, Pete straightened up and walked away, resuming his casual ranger patrol as if nothing had happened. Sarah sat in stunned silence, processing this unexpected development. Another ally or an elaborate trap? She thought about Marcus, probably still unconscious from the accident, and realized she had no choice but to trust her instincts. She started the Honda and drove toward Route 9, taking a circuitous route to avoid the town center. As she navigated the winding mountain roads, she noticed a black sedan in her rear-view mirror, maintaining a steady distance behind her. Her stomach clenched. They'd found her again. Sarah pressed the accelerator harder, taking the curves faster than felt safe. The sedan kept pace effortlessly. She could see 2 figures in the front seats, but the tinted windows obscured their faces. A road sign indicated the lumber mill was just ahead. Sarah made a split-second decision and took a sharp right turn onto a dirt access road, her tires skidding on the wet gravel. The black sedan shot past the turnoff, apparently caught off guard. She didn't have much time. The abandoned lumber mill loomed ahead, its broken windows and rusted machinery creating an ominous silhouette against the grey sky. Pete's truck was already there, parked behind the main building. Sarah grabbed the journal and her backpack and ran toward the mill, her footsteps echoing off the concrete loading dock. Inside, she found Pete waiting in what had once been the mill office, a manila envelope in his hands. "They followed you," he said without preamble. "I know. I lost them, but not for long." Pete handed her the envelope. "Everything my grandfather knew is in there. Names, dates, photographs of the trains. And Sarah, that's your name, right? You're not the only one they're after." Sarah's hands shook as she stared at the photograph Heinrich had placed on the kitchen table. The black and white image showed her grandmother as a young woman, standing beside a Nazi officer outside what was unmistakably the cabin. Eleanor's smile was radiant, her hand resting on the man's uniformed arm. "Your grandmother was quite beautiful," Heinrich said softly. "Hans was completely taken with her when they met in 1943. "This is impossible." Sarah's voice came out as a whisper. "My grandmother fought against the Nazis. She helped refugees escape." Heinrich's weathered face creased with what might have been sympathy. "She did both, my dear. Eleanor was more complex than your family knew." Jake stepped closer, positioning himself between Sarah and the old man. "Even if this is true, it doesn't give you any right to the gold, doesn't it?" Heinrich's pale eyes glittered. "Hans Kruger was my father." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the table, her pregnant belly suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. "Your father?" He was a low-ranking officer, not one of the high command. When he realized Germany would fall, he began planning his escape. Eleanor helped him hide the gold here, thinking they would retrieve it together after the war and start a new life in South America. Sarah studied the photograph again, looking for any sign of deception in her grandmother's young face. The woman in the picture looked nothing like the stern, principled Eleanor who had raised her after her parents died. What happened to him? He was killed in Berlin, 3 weeks before the war ended. Heinrich's voice carried decades of grief. Eleanor waited for him, but when the truth reached her months later, she decided to keep the secret buried. She never touched the gold. "Because she realized what it represented," Sarah said, anger building in her chest. She understood it was stolen from innocent people. Perhaps. Or perhaps she simply couldn't bear the memories. Heinrich reached into his coat and pulled out a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. She wrote to him regularly, even after his death. "I found these among her effects when she died." Sarah's breath caught. She recognized her grandmother's handwriting on the yellowed envelopes. "How did you get those?" I've been searching for Hans's final hiding place for 40 years. When Eleanor died, I came to pay my respects and to see if she had left any clues. She had a heart attack while I was there. Jake's face darkened.
You were there when she died?
I called the ambulance, but it was too late. She pressed these letters into my hands with her final breath and whispered one word, Thomas. Heinrich looked directly at Sarah. Your grandfather's name. The kitchen felt like it was spinning around Sarah. Every certainty about her family, about her grandmother's past, was crumbling. She wanted Thomas to know. She wanted someone to know the truth. The gold has been a burden for 70 years. First hers, now yours. But other people know about it, Jake interjected. The men who attacked Sarah, the ones who've been watching the cabin. Heinrich nodded grimly. When I began asking questions about Eleanor after her death, I attracted the wrong kind of attention. There are organizations that have spent decades hunting for missing Nazi treasure. They don't care about the rightful owners or moral obligations. Sarah felt the baby kick, as if responding to her elevated heart rate. She placed both hands on her belly, trying to center herself. What do they want? Everything. The gold, the silence of anyone who knows about it, and the preservation of certain wartime secrets that could still destroy powerful families today. What families? Jake demanded. Heinrich hesitated, glancing toward the windows. Hans wasn't the only one involved in hiding assets. There were American businessmen, Swiss bankers, Vatican officials, a network of people who profited from Nazi gold. Some of their children and grandchildren still hold positions of influence. The sound of car engines outside made all three of them freeze. Heinrich moved quickly to the window, peering through the curtain. His face paled. They've found us. Sarah heard the doors slamming, the crunch of boots on gravel. How many? Too many. Heinrich turned to face them, and for the first time she saw genuine fear in his eyes. There's something else you need to know about the gold. Something I haven't told you. What? Sarah could hear voices outside now, men organizing themselves around the cabin. It wasn't just stolen from Jewish families. Heinrich's voice was urgent. Some of it belonged to American POWs, British resistance fighters, French civilians. If the truth comes out about who helped hide it, it could expose collaboration that goes to the highest levels of government. A loud bang echoed from the front door. Then another. They're not just here for the treasure, Heinrich whispered. They're here to bury the truth forever, along with anyone who knows it. The headlights cut through the mountain darkness as Sarah navigated the winding road back toward the cabin. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, Greta's revelations still echoing in her mind. The gold wasn't just stolen. It was blood money, torn from the hands of families who'd been murdered for it. And now those same families' descendants were coming to reclaim what had been taken from their ancestors. She pulled into the cabin's driveway, her heart sinking at the sight of another vehicle already parked there, a black SUV with government plates. Through the windows she could see movement inside the cabin, shadows dancing across the walls from flashlight beams. Sarah killed the engine and sat in the darkness, her baby shifting restlessly inside her. She couldn't run, not anymore. Detective Morrison had been right about one thing. This was bigger than her grandmother's secrets. But she also couldn't let them simply take everything without understanding the full truth. She slipped out of her car and crept toward the cabin's back entrance, the same route she'd used countless times as a child playing hide-and-seek with grandmother Anna. The old wooden steps still creaked in all the same places, and she carefully avoided them as she made her way to the rear window. Through the glass she could see three figures moving methodically through the main room. They weren't Detective Morrison or Agent Phillips. These were new players in a game that seemed to expand with each passing hour. The leader was a woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back severely, directing two younger men as they systematically searched every corner of the cabin. The manifest indicates there should be more, the woman was saying in accented English. The Kellner family alone lost 47 pieces of jewelry. We've only recovered 12. Sarah's blood chilled. These were the descendants Greta had warned her about. the families who'd spent decades tracking down their stolen heritage. They weren't just after the gold, they were after justice, and she was standing between them and closure they'd waited 70 years to find. One of the younger men emerged from the basement, shaking his head. Nothing else down there, just empty boxes and dust. The woman's expression hardened. Then someone moved it recently. The intelligence was specific. This location contained at least $3 million worth of artifacts. 3 million. Sarah's mind reeled. Even if she gave up everything she'd found, it wouldn't satisfy them. They believed there was so much more, and they wouldn't stop searching until they found it or confirmed it was gone forever. Her phone buzzed with a text message, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the quiet night. She fumbled to silence it, but the damage was done. The voices inside the cabin stopped abruptly. "Did you hear something?" one of the men asked. Sarah pressed herself against the cabin wall, her heart hammering as footsteps approached the window. She held her breath, feeling her baby respond to her stress with a series of sharp kicks. The flashlight beam swept past her hiding spot, missing her by inches. "Probably just an animal," the woman said dismissively. "We need to finish here and check the other properties on the list. The Brennan woman can't have vanished completely." Other properties. Sarah realized with growing horror that they'd been tracking not just the cabin, but everywhere she might go. Her apartment, her friends' houses, even David's place, nowhere was safe. As the search team moved to another room, Sarah carefully made her way back to her car. She needed to think, needed a plan that went beyond simply running or hiding. But as she reached for her door handle, another vehicle's headlights swept across the driveway. Detective Morrison's unmarked police car pulled up behind the SUV, and Sarah watched from the shadows as he climbed out, his hand resting on his service weapon. This was about to become a confrontation between law enforcement and international treasure hunters, with her caught in the middle. She made a split-second decision that surprised even her. Instead of fleeing, she stepped out of the shadows and approached Morrison before he could enter the cabin. "Detective," she called softly. "We need to talk." He spun toward her, his weapon half drawn before he recognized her voice. "Jesus Christ, Sarah. What are you doing here? And who the hell is in your grandmother's cabin?" "The people who really own the gold," she said simply. "The families it was stolen from. Detective, there's something you need to know before you go in there. This isn't just about stolen Nazi treasure anymore." Morrison's expression shifted from irritation to genuine concern as he saw the exhaustion and fear in her eyes. "What are you talking about?" "I know who killed my grandmother," Sarah said, "and I know why. But if we don't handle this exactly right, a lot more people are going to die before this is over." Inside the cabin, they could hear furniture being moved, the systematic destruction of everything Anna Kellner had spent decades hiding. The basement of the cabin felt different now, charged with danger and the weight of decades-old secrets. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness as she descended the creaking wooden steps, her swollen belly making each movement careful and deliberate. Behind her, Marcus followed, his own light sweeping the corners where shadows gathered like guilty whispers. There, Sarah pointed to the far wall where loose stones had caught her attention during her first exploration. "I noticed the mortar was different, newer." Marcus knelt beside the wall, running his fingers along the suspicious seams. "Your grandmother was thorough. This looks like it was sealed decades ago." He pulled a small crowbar from his jacket. "Stand back." The first stone came free with surprising ease, revealing a dark cavity beyond. The musty air that escaped carried something else, the metallic scent of old secrets. As Marcus worked to widen the opening, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message that made her blood freeze. "We know you found something. Give us what belongs to us, or your baby pays the price." Her hands trembled as she showed Marcus the message. His jaw tightened as he read. "How did they get your number?" "I don't know, but they're watching us somehow." Sarah glanced nervously at the basement windows, their glass black against the night. "Maybe we should—" "There's something here." Marcus had enlarged the opening enough to reach inside. He withdrew a canvas bag, heavy and clinking with promise. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were 3 gold bars stamped with Nazi eagles and swastikas. Sarah stared at the artifacts, understanding flooding through her. My grandmother wasn't just hiding refugees, she was hiding their stolen wealth from the Nazis who wanted it back. And now those same people, or their descendants, want to reclaim what they think is theirs. Marcus carefully rewrapped the gold. Sarah, this isn't just about money. These bars are evidence of war crimes, theft, murder. People have killed to keep this secret buried. A sound from upstairs, the soft creak of a floorboard, made them both freeze. Sarah clicked off her flashlight, and Marcus followed suit, plunging them into absolute darkness. They waited, hearts pounding, listening to the silence above. Another creak, then footsteps moving deliberately across the cabin floor. Marcus leaned close to Sarah's ear, his whisper barely audible. "Is there another way out of here?" She nodded, remembering the root cellar entrance she'd discovered behind the old furnace. Taking his hand, she guided him through the darkness, their movements painfully slow to avoid making noise. The canvas bag rustled softly as Marcus clutched it against his chest. Above them, the footsteps stopped. Then came the distinctive sound of the basement door opening. Light spilled down the stairs as someone began descending. Sarah pressed herself against the cold stone wall, feeling the baby shift restlessly in her womb as if sensing the danger. Marcus positioned himself protectively in front of her, the crowbar ready in his free hand. The intruder's flashlight beam swept methodically across the basement, pausing at the opened wall where they'd found the gold. A man's voice, accented and coldly professional, spoke into what sounded like a radio. They found the hiding place. It's been breached. Sarah recognized something in that voice, the same inflection she'd heard in the threatening phone calls. This wasn't some random treasure hunter. This was personal, connected to whatever web of secrets her grandmother had been part of all those years ago. The beam moved closer to their hiding spot. Sarah held her breath, one hand protectively over her belly, the other gripping Marcus's arm. The baby chose that moment to deliver a strong kick, and Sarah bit her lip to stifle a gasp of surprise. The light stopped moving. "I know you're down here," the man called out. "This doesn't have to end badly. We just want what was taken from us, what your grandmother stole." Anger flared in Sarah's chest. Her grandmother had been a hero, saving lives while these people committed atrocities. She started to step forward, but Marcus held her back, shaking his head urgently. The footsteps moved away from their position, heading toward the far corner of the basement. This was their chance. Marcus squeezed Sarah's hand and nodded toward the root cellar entrance. They moved as silently as shadows, Sarah's knowledge of the cabin's layout guiding them through obstacles in the darkness. The root cellar door opened with the faintest whisper of hinges. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and freedom. They crawled through the low opening, emerging into the woods behind the cabin where Sarah's car waited on the old logging road. As they reached the vehicle, Sarah looked back at the cabin, her grandmother's sanctuary that had become a battleground for the sins of the past. Light moved behind the windows as their pursuer continued searching. Marcus started the engine, keeping the headlights off as they navigated by moonlight. Only when they reached the main road did Sarah allow herself to breathe normally again, but she knew this was far from over. The storm had passed, leaving the forest eerily quiet except for the steady drip of water from pine boughs. Sarah pressed herself against the rough bark of an ancient oak, her breath coming in shallow puffs that hung in the cold morning air. Through the trees, she could see Klaus moving methodically through the underbrush, his rifle held at the ready. He was patient, experienced, a hunter who understood his prey. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly, where the baby shifted restlessly as if sensing the danger. The weight of the evidence, photographs, documents, and the damning journal that revealed her grandmother's true identity pressed against her ribs in the waterproof pouch she'd fashioned from a garbage bag. Everything that could expose the conspiracy was with her, making her both powerful and utterly vulnerable. The snap of a branch to her left made her freeze. Klaus had circled around, trying to flank her. Sarah bit back a gasp and forced herself to move deeper into the woods, away from the cabin that had become a death trap. Each step seemed impossibly loud in the morning stillness, despite the carpet of wet leaves that should have muffled her footfalls. "Sarah!" Klaus's voice echoed through the trees, deceptively warm and grandfatherly. "You're only making this harder on yourself. The cold isn't good for the baby." She didn't respond, couldn't risk giving away her position. Instead, she continued her careful retreat toward the old logging road she remembered from childhood summers. If she could reach it, she might have a chance of flagging down a passing vehicle, assuming anyone used the remote road anymore. Behind her, Klaus's footsteps had stopped. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant call of a crow. Sarah's muscles tensed as she realized he was listening, trying to track her movement. She remained perfectly still, counting her heartbeats, fighting the urge to run. The sound of an engine made her head snap up. A vehicle was approaching on the logging road, still distant but growing closer. Hope flared in her chest, followed immediately by dread. It could be help, or it could be more of Klaus's people coming to finish what he'd started. She had to take the chance. Moving as quietly as possible, she began working her way toward the sound, using the thick stands of pine to mask her approach. The engine noise grew louder, accompanied now by the crunch of tires on gravel. Through the trees, she caught a glimpse of red paint, a pickup truck moving slowly along the rutted road. Klaus had heard it too. She could see him in the distance, changing direction, trying to intercept her before she could reach potential help. His age showed in his movements now. The night of hunting had taken its toll on his 70-year-old frame, but he was still dangerous, still determined. Sarah broke into a stumbling run, crashing through the underbrush as quietly as she could manage. Branches caught at her clothes and hair, and her swollen belly made her clumsy, but desperation drove her forward. The truck was almost parallel to her position now, moving at a crawl as its driver navigated the deteriorated road. She burst from the tree line just as the vehicle passed, waving frantically at the startled driver. The truck, an old Ford driven by a grizzled man in a flannel shirt, lurched to a stop. "Help me," Sarah gasped, rushing to the passenger door. "Please, someone's trying to kill me." The driver took in her disheveled appearance, her obvious pregnancy, and the terror in her eyes. Without hesitation, he leaned across to unlock the door. "Get in." Sarah hauled herself into the cab just as Klaus emerged from the woods 50 yards behind her, his rifle raised. The driver saw him and gunned the engine, spraying gravel as they accelerated down the road. "Jesus Christ," the man muttered, checking his rearview mirror. "That bastard's got a gun. I'm calling the cops." "No," Sarah said quickly. "Not yet. Please, drive to town first, to the newspaper office. This is bigger than just me." The driver, his name was Tom, he told her, and he worked for the Forestry Service, glanced at her with concern but nodded. As they bumped along the rough road toward civilization, Sarah allowed herself the first full breath she'd taken in hours. But even as relief flooded through her, she knew this was far from over. Klaus represented just one tentacle of an organization that had successfully hidden its crimes for 8 decades. They had money, influence, and the patience that came from generations of secret-keeping. They wouldn't give up simply because she'd escaped the woods. The pouch containing the evidence pressed against her side like a burning coal. She thought of her grandmother, not the gentle woman who'd taught her to bake cookies and braid hair, but the young resistance fighter who'd risked everything to document Nazi crimes. Anna Kowalski had paid the ultimate price for her courage, living alive for 60 years to protect these secrets. Now it was Sarah's turn to be brave, not just for herself, but for her unborn child who deserved to inherit a world where justice could finally be served. The warehouse fell silent, except for the steady drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Sarah pressed herself against the cold concrete wall, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give away her position. The baby shifted restlessly inside her, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them both. "She's here somewhere," Victor's voice echoed from across the cavernous space. The car's still warm. Sarah clutched the leather journal tighter against her chest. Inside were the names, the bank account numbers, the detailed records of everyone who had profited from her grandmother's stolen cash. 3 generations of carefully hidden complicity, all documented in Anna's meticulous handwriting. A flashlight beam swept past her hiding spot behind a stack of wooden crates. Sarah held her breath, feeling the baby press against her ribs. She needed to get out, but Victor's men had positioned themselves at every exit. The trap had closed around her the moment she'd entered the building. "You know, Sarah," Victor called out, his accent making her name sound like a curse, "your grandmother was a practical woman. She understood that some secrets are worth more than gold." Another beam of light, closer this time. Sarah forced herself to move deeper into the maze of storage containers and abandoned machinery. Her ankle, still tender from the cabin incident, protested with each step. "Anna never intended for you to find that journal," Victor continued. "She spent 60 years protecting all of us. Don't you think you should honor that?" The metallic taste of fear filled Sarah's mouth. She could hear footsteps moving systematically through the warehouse, searching every shadow, every possible hiding place. They were herding her toward the back of the building, she realized. But why? Her phone buzzed against her hip, a text message, the screen glowing dangerously bright in the darkness. She quickly covered it, but not before reading Detective Morrison's words, "Building surrounded." "Keep him talking." Relief flooded through her so suddenly her knees nearly buckled. Help was coming. She just had to survive long enough for it to arrive. "You want to know about Anna?" Sarah called out, surprised by the strength in her own voice. She spent every day of her life regretting what she'd done. The money, the gold, it was eating her alive. Victor's laughter was cold. "Regret? Your grandmother lived like a queen. The best neighborhoods, the finest clothes, that guilt you think she carried? It looked remarkably like comfort from where I stood." "Then why the journal?" Sarah moved again, using his voice to mask the sound of her footsteps. Why document everything if she was so comfortable with the arrangement? The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the warehouse was completely still. "Insurance," Victor said finally. "Your grandmother was many things, but she wasn't naive. She knew that secrets like ours require maintenance." Sarah found herself near the back wall now, exactly where they'd been driving her. A door marked emergency exit stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness beyond. The perfect trap, or perhaps her only chance. "The maintenance is over," she said, stepping toward the door. "I'm taking the journal to the FBI. Every name, every account number, every dirty transaction." "No." Victor's voice was closer now, perhaps 20 feet away. "You're not." The emergency door opened further, and Sarah saw why they'd herded her here. More men waited outside, their silhouettes blocking the exit. She was surrounded completely now, trapped between Victor's team and whatever lay beyond that door. But then she heard it. The distant sound of sirens growing louder by the second. Victor heard them too, his curse echoed through the warehouse, followed by rapid footsteps and urgent whispers. "Change of plans," Victor shouted to his men. "We're leaving, now." The flashlight beams began moving away from her position, converging toward what must be another exit. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. The sirens were much closer now, their wailing filling the night air. She heard car engines starting up outside, tires squealing against asphalt. Through a grimy window, she caught glimpses of headlights disappearing into the darkness. Victor was running, but this wasn't over. Men like him didn't abandon 40 years of carefully maintained secrets without a fight. The warehouse door burst open, and Detective Morrison's voice cut through the darkness. "Sarah? Sarah, are you in here?" "Here," she called out, stepping into the open. "I'm here." Morrison's flashlight found her, and she saw the relief in his eyes. Behind him, uniformed officers were already spreading through the building, securing the scene. "The journal?" he asked. Sarah held it up, Anna's final gift clutched in her trembling hands. "Everything's here," Names, dates, account numbers, enough to bring down the whole network. Morrison nodded grimly. Then let's finish what your grandmother started. The baby kicked, strong and insistent, as if approving of the decision. Sarah placed her hand over the movement, drawing strength from the life growing within her. The secrets were finally coming into the light. The abandoned mining facility loomed against the storm-darkened sky like a monument to forgotten greed. Sarah pressed herself against the rusted metal siding, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as she watched Marcus direct his men through the maze of deteriorating equipment. The baby kicked hard against her ribs as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. Detective Morrison crouched beside her, his service weapon drawn. "We should wait for backup," he whispered, but Sarah shook her head. "Elena doesn't have time." She clutched the leather journal tighter, its pages containing the final pieces of evidence that could destroy the conspiracy her grandmother had died protecting. "They'll kill her the moment they realize we're not coming alone." Through a gap in the corrugated wall, she could see Elena tied to a chair near the center of the main processing building, her silver hair matted with blood. Marcus paced around her like a predator, his expensive suit incongruous among the industrial decay. 2 armed men flanked the exits, while a third kept watch from an elevated platform. "Your grandmother was a foolish romantic," Marcus was saying, his voice carrying across the empty space. "She actually believed she could use that gold to build something better, to atone for the sins of the past." He laughed bitterly. "But some sins are too profitable to atone for." Sarah's mind raced through the revelations of the past weeks. The Nazi gold her grandmother had hidden wasn't just stolen treasure. It was the foundation of a financial empire that had grown for decades, laundering blood money through legitimate businesses, political campaigns, and charitable foundations. Marcus and his associates had killed to protect that secret, and they would kill again. Morrison touched her shoulder. "There's a service tunnel that runs under the main building. If I can create a distraction—" "No." Sarah stood slowly, her decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "This ends here. All of it." She stepped out from behind their cover, raising her hands as Marcus's men immediately trained their weapons on her. "Sarah Chen," Marcus called out, genuine pleasure in his voice. "You've led us quite a chase. I trust you brought the journal?" She walked forward deliberately, each step calculated. "I brought it, along with copies sent to 3 different news organizations, the FBI and the International Criminal Court in The Hague." The lie rolled off her tongue smoothly. "Insurance policy." Marcus's smile faltered slightly. "Bluffing doesn't suit you. If that were true, you wouldn't be here." "Wouldn't I?" Sarah stopped 20 feet away, close enough to see the uncertainty creeping into his eyes. "You killed my grandmother. You destroyed my life. Did you really think I'd just run away? Your grandmother stole from us, from my family. That gold was our inheritance, our birthright." His mask of civility was slipping, revealing something ugly beneath. "She had no right—" "Your family were Nazis," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying across the silent space. "Collaborators and murderers. My grandmother spent her life trying to return what was stolen from Holocaust victims." Elena lifted her head weakly. "Sarah, don't—" Marcus backhanded the old woman viciously. "Your precious Elena here has been telling me such interesting stories about your grandmother's little network. Did you know there are caches like yours hidden across 3 states? Millions of dollars in assets we've been tracking down for years." The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Sarah placed a protective hand over her belly. "The network's gone, Marcus. Elena was the last one, and now that you know the truth, you're going to die with it." Marcus nodded to his men. "Both of you." Morrison's voice boomed from the shadows. "Federal agent, drop your weapons." Chaos erupted. Marcus's men spun toward Morrison's position, automatic weapons chattering in the enclosed space. Sarah threw herself sideways, rolling behind a massive piece of rusted machinery as bullets sparked off metal around her. Elena's chair toppled over, the old woman crying out as she hit the concrete. But Sarah wasn't looking for cover. In the confusion, she was moving toward the manual controls for the building's overhead crane system, the journal tucked against her chest. Her grandmother's final entry had described more than just the location of the gold. It had detailed the explosive charges she'd helped plant during the mine's closure, charges that were never detonated. Her fingers found the control panel, decades of dust and grime coating the switches. The mining company had gone bankrupt before the demolition was completed, leaving tons of explosives dormant in the support pillars. Her grandmother had written about them with the precision of someone who'd worked with explosives during the war. Morrison's gunfire had driven Marcus's men to cover, but it was only a matter of time before they regrouped. Sarah's hand hovered over the crane's emergency release, her heart pounding as she calculated angles and distances. The massive hook and cable assembly hung directly over the primary support beam her grandmother had marked in the journal. Everything her grandmother had fought for, everything she'd died protecting, came down to this moment. Sarah closed her eyes, felt her baby move within her, and made her choice. The courthouse steps felt cold beneath Sarah's feet as she emerged into the crisp morning air, clutching the manila envelope that contained her grandmother's confession letter and the documentation that would finally set everything right. 3 months had passed since that terrifying night at the cabin, and the legal machinery had moved with surprising swiftness once the full scope of the Nazi gold discovery became clear. Agent Morrison stood waiting by a black sedan, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "How did it go?" he asked as she approached. "Judge Patterson approved the final restitution plan," Sarah said, her voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "The remaining families will receive their shares within 60 days. She placed a protective hand on her rounded belly, now prominently showing at 7 months. "It's finally over." The investigation had unraveled decades of carefully constructed lies. Heinrich Kruger's network had been more extensive than anyone imagined, reaching into banking, politics, and law enforcement. Sarah's grandmother, they'd learned, had been just one of many unwilling participants coerced into hiding stolen assets through threats against her family. "We arrested the last of Kruger's associates yesterday," Morrison said as they walked toward his car. "Martin Webb finally broke and gave us the names we needed. Turns out your grandmother left more than just that confession letter. She'd been documenting everything for years, keeping records we never knew existed." Sarah nodded, thinking of the hidden compartment they'd found in the cabin's foundation, filled with photographs, letters, and meticulous notes her grandmother had maintained as insurance against the very people who'd eventually tried to kill Sarah for stumbling upon their secret. The irony wasn't lost on her that her grandmother's paranoia and careful documentation had ultimately protected them both across the decades. "What about Frank?" Sarah asked as they reached the sedan. Morrison's expression darkened. 25 to life. He won't see the outside of a federal prison again." He paused, studying her face. "I know he was family, Sarah. I'm sorry it had to end that way." Sarah touched her belly again, feeling the baby's strong kick against her ribs. "He made his choices long before I was born. I just wish my grandmother could have lived to see this resolved." The past months had brought revelations about her family that still left her reeling. Her grandmother's marriage to her grandfather hadn't been the simple love story Sarah had always believed. It had been a refuge, a way to disappear into a new identity after the war, when the gold's discovery had made her a target. Even Sarah's mother had never known the truth, dying in ignorance of the burden her mother had carried. "There's something else," Morrison said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "We found this among Webb's possessions." He handed her a small, leather-bound photograph album. "Your grandmother apparently gave it to Kruger as collateral years ago. Thought you might want it back." Sarah opened the album with trembling fingers. The first page showed her grandmother as a young woman, barely 20, standing in front of a house Sarah didn't recognize. She was laughing, her arms around an elderly couple who must have been Sarah's great-grandparents. Page after page revealed a life before the war, before the secrets and fear, when her grandmother had been simply Anna Müller, a baker's daughter from a small German town. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, closing the album carefully. This means everything. As Morrison drove her back to the small apartment she'd rented in town, Sarah watched the familiar landscape roll past. The cabin remained empty, too tainted by memory for her to ever consider living there again. She'd decided to sell it once the legal proceedings concluded, using the money to start fresh somewhere new. The baby kicked again, more insistently this time, and Sarah smiled despite everything. In 4 weeks, she would have a daughter. She'd learned that at her last ultrasound, and this child would grow up free from the shadows that had haunted 3 generations of women before her. Her phone buzzed with a text from David, museum dedication ceremony confirmed for next month. The families want you there when they unveil the memorial. Sarah typed back, "I'll be there." The memorial would honor not just the Holocaust victims whose stolen gold had finally been returned to their families, but also people like her grandmother, ordinary individuals caught in extraordinary circumstances, forced to make impossible choices to protect the people they loved. Standing later that evening in her small kitchen, preparing dinner while watching the sunset through her window, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: peace. The nightmares had finally stopped. The fear that had lived in her chest like a constant weight had lifted. She placed both hands on her belly and spoke softly to her unborn daughter. "It's over, little one. You're going to grow up in the light." The baby responded with a gentle flutter, as if she understood that the sins of the past would not follow them into tomorrow.